What's up, guys? This is Ryan from Bible Dingers, and I want to welcome you to another exciting video in the God and Science series. Today, we have a very special guest on the show, a legend of a man, Dr. Michael Behe. Dr. Behe, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Dr. Behe, for people who are unfamiliar about you and your work, can you give us a little bit of background?
Yeah, I am a scientist, a biochemist. I got into biochemistry just because I enjoyed it, and I've developed a particular interest for evolution. I didn't used to think much about evolution when I was studying, getting my doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. I did other things, but in the late 1980s, I read a book that was skeptical of Darwin's theory. And that really startled me because it asked questions that I didn't have answers for. And so I became very interested in it. Currently, I'm a professor in the biology department at Lehigh University, and I've written 3 books on the topic of intelligent design. And the first one was way back in 1996, called Darwin's Black Box, and it is skeptical. It discusses the very elegant and sophisticated structures that underlie the molecular foundation of life. Biochemistry is the study of the molecules of life, and so that's where I focus my attention. And then I've written 2 subsequent books, one called The Edge of Evolution in the late 2000s, and then a couple years ago, something called Darwin Devolves. And in each of them, I try to advance the argument further that Darwin's mechanism in particular is a crummy explanation for the molecular foundation of life, and that a much better explanation is deliberate intelligent design.
So there's several things I want to talk about. I love your work. And the first one, I know that you famously coined the term and I suppose the idea of irreducible complexity. Um, could you give us a little bit of an explanation of what that is?
Yes, irreducible complexity, it sounds pretty fancy, but it just stands for something simple. And that is that a lot of systems, especially machines, need multiple components in order to work. And in my book, I used as an example from our everyday world, a standard ordinary mousetrap, mechanical mousetrap. And mechanical mousetrap usually has a number of parts, got a wooden base that all the other parts are attached to. It's got usually a tightly wound metal spring, and that has extended ends that push against the platform and against another metal part, which is called the hammer, which is the part you pull over, and when you let it go, it can squash the mouse. But there's also a couple things that'll keep it in position until the mouse comes along. And I pointed out that Darwin said that his theory had to work by improving systems by numerous successive slight modifications. And he always insisted on that because he said that evolution had to be gradual, because if things improved quickly and in large leaps, then it would look suspiciously as if something other than chance mutations were involved. And I asked, well, I pointed out that irreducibly complex systems can't be built gradually, or it's real tough to see how they can, because the function isn't there until pretty much the whole thing is complete. So a mousetrap, if you just start out with a wooden platform, it's not going to catch any mice. If you throw down a spring that's not connected to anything, it's still not going to catch any mice. You've got to have everything pretty much in place before it works. And so therefore, it's not easy to see and nobody, not only me, but nobody I've come across in 25 years has been able to explain how you could build something like a mousetrap by numerous successive slight modifications. And the relevance to life is that modern science has discovered that the molecular foundation of life is run by molecular machines, literally machines made out of molecules. And like a mousetrap, and like pretty much any other machine you come across, they have a lot of different parts that are needed. And if you don't have the correct parts in the correct place, it doesn't work. And so again, it's hard to see how they could be built by Darwin's mechanism.
So one of the most common rebuttals I think I've seen to irreducible complexity is people claiming that sort of these mechanisms are they're becoming the mousetrap over time, but previous to that, they weren't used in the mousetrap function. And for instance, I think the most common example people talk about is the one where I forget who it was, but he said he used the mousetrap as a tie clip when it was missing the hammer, so on and so forth. So what do you say in response to that? That it's not necessarily that these parts were made to function as a mousetrap originally, but over time, as it became more complex, it turned into a mousetrap.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've heard that objection since 1996, and I think the man you're thinking of is named Ken Miller, who's a professor of biology at Brown University. Yeah, he said that, well, I can use part of the mousetrap as a tie clip, or in general, as you say, the parts could have been done, could have started out doing something else. But in the book itself, in Darwin's Black Box, I addressed that objection. I says, well, okay, suppose you went into your garage and you wanted to build a mousetrap. You might say, well, I have this piece of a plank. I can use that for the wooden base. Okay. And you put it down, but the problem is it doesn't work as a mousetrap. And you say, well, here's a grandfather clock and it's got a spring inside it. Maybe I can use that as the spring for the mousetrap. And again, the problem is, well, that it's still not working as a mousetrap. And with each part, you see that you still have to get all of them together before it works. So it's not that, a piece over here and a piece over here could be co-opted, as the jargon goes. It's that they all have to be assembled and put in place before it works. And so that doesn't work anymore. And I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a common objection that you hear, because I've been hearing it since 1996, and I addressed it and I answered it in 1997, and nobody paid any attention. Or the other guys just don't deal with it. They bring up the same objections, year after year, decade after decade. So just last year, the Discovery Institute, which is a pro-intelligent design think tank, which I'm a part of, we collected all of my answers to critics from over the past several decades and put them together in a book called A Mousetrap for Darwin. And so I hope that people who hear objections to my arguments will go there first and see if I've addressed it over the years. And turns out I've addressed lots and lots of these arguments.
Yeah, I have seen that you have responded to that, and the rebuttals I see to irreducible complexity seem to have not gotten much more complex over the years.
Yeah. Just as it's funny. Yeah, it's apparently the go-to arguments for Darwin's theory haven't changed much since Darwin, because critics right after he wrote Origin of Species, pointed out that if you have complex organs like the vertebrate eyeball, you know, they need lots of parts. You can't see how that would be put together, and it's extremely sophisticated. And Darwin said, yeah, well, what if you had just a little cell or a little spot that had was light sensitive? He didn't explain how that could be. He didn't know anything about cells or molecules. But he says, well, if you have that and then somehow it gets into a little depressed region, now maybe light coming from one side would cast a shadow on the other side, and the creature could tell which direction the light was coming from. He said, well, if you start doing that and you start filling it with a gelatinous material, maybe you've got the beginnings of a lens. And he went over that until he's convinced himself and that maybe it could make an eye. But that was in, in the middle of the 1800s. And if you go today and ask yourself, okay, after all of this enormous progress by science and biology in the intervening years, now we can clone genes, now we can, make vaccines for viruses in split seconds, it seems. How have people filled in that argument? And it turns out they will say, if you ask, yeah, how about the eye? They'll say, yeah, well, suppose you start with a little light sensitive spot, and they give you the exact same argument that Charles Darwin gave in the 19th century. So we've got great science. We have 21st century science, which is wonderful in terms of what it can do and how it has elucidated the molecular underpinnings of life. But in terms of how it came about, we're still stuck with a 19th century theory that hasn't improved, and in many ways has gone very, very quickly backwards in the intervening time.
So I wanted to make sure the viewers understand. Can you sort of lay out what the implications are of irreducible complexity?
Sure, there's a few. The one that gets the most attention is that it kind of stymies Darwin's mechanism of how evolution might work. He always proposed that, well, if a creature was born that had some variation that somehow improved its ability to survive, then it would, the odds would be good that it would survive and have more opportunities to leave more offspring. And if the offspring inherited that variation, then more of the next generation would have it too. And after a few generations, maybe the whole population would have it. And so now it's the regular feature, not a variation. And then if another variation came along and improved things, well, you could repeat the same scenario forever. But the problem is that it's not just a variation and improvement. You've got to build specific structures. And many of the structures in life, just like many of the machinery of our everyday world, is complicated and has a lot of different parts. And so the irreducible complexity very strongly resists these explanations, these Darwinian explanations. If you're serious about an explanation, you always have to remember that Darwinists don't look too closely at their explanations, and they have a much, much lower standard of evidence than other people do. So the most sophisticated, the best, the most highly investigated theory that science has produced for how life may have evolved or gotten its feature is utterly incapable of explaining things. So before Darwin, of course, most everybody in the world, and probably most everybody in the world, still thinks that life was purposely designed. And since then, scientists and other folks dismiss that conclusion as, oh, that's, uh, you're just wishing, it's just like you're hoping that there's a God and that this will explain it. But as I write in my books, I try to emphasize that coming to a conclusion of intelligent design is an empirical conclusion. We decide that things were designed all the time based on their physical properties. That mousetrap that you come across, if you saw it for the first time, you would quickly conclude it was purposely designed, because in the dictionary, a definition of design is the purposeful arrangement of parts. That is, when you take a part and you put it here and you match it with one over here, and you're putting these things together because you have a purpose for them to fulfill. It's usually pretty obvious to us folks that these parts have been arranged. And the reason is that minds, consciousnesses, we can have purposes. Nothing in the inanimate world has a purpose. So when we see things that do have a purposeful design, we can conclude that there are minds behind them. And again, the mousetrap is a good example. Another example that I routinely point to is Mount Rushmore, where even if you had never heard of Mount Rushmore before, you could immediately tell just from the shape of the rocks and how the pieces of it fit together into faces that it was purposely arranged. That's simply how we conclude that there are other minds besides our own in the world. And so I have written that we can conclude firmly from the purposefulness and the complexity and sophistication of the very foundation of life that it was intelligently designed.
So you sort of alluded to a little bit how opponents to your view will bring up the God of the gaps rebuttal. And they would say that just because we can't explain certain things doesn't mean we can just stick a creator in there. And that's what we're doing. It's sort of wishful thinking. And it's also, I've heard it called lazy science by certain scientists, because we're not trying to figure out the true cause of things. We're just sort of sticking God in there. So what would you have to say in response to that?
Well, a number of things. Number one, I'm a Catholic, and I had never heard the phrase "God of the gaps" before I wrote my book. So it's not because I was trying to do anything, make any particular point about God. It's just that, as I argued, or as I explained, this is how we conclude that something is designed. And additionally, well, a couple of things. Number one, saying that, this guy's being lazy and you're not working hard to discover how evolution really made life begs the question, because you're assuming that a designer did not make it. And if you decide that you won't accept a designer, then it's always going to be the case that somebody who does conclude that is, in your mind, being lazy. Additionally, it is not ignorance that this same argument is, or the same label is sometimes called the argument from ignorance. That is, I can't think of a way that these could be put together by some evolutionary unintelligent process. So it must have been designed. it's not ignorance that allows us to conclude they were designed. It is knowledge. It is the discoveries of modern science that show the sophisticated arrangement of parts in the cell. It was a whole lot easier to think that Darwin's theory might be true when we didn't know anything about the cell, as Darwin did not. And in the early parts of the 20th century, when nobody knew what carried genetic information, they didn't know with sugar molecules or proteins, or people thought DNA was just a structural component of the cell. It has been through the progress of science where we've discovered molecular machines and genetic information and translation and transcription and all these things associated in our everyday world with intelligence. That has allowed us to conclude that these things are designed. One more point, I'm getting on a roll here. One more point. One more point is that there have been times in the past where people have proposed an explanation that that other folks thought had philosophical implications. And what's more, the proposers couldn't tell a mechanism or how such a thing could happen, that have turned out to be accepted and turned out to be correct. And one is Isaac Newton, way back in the 1500s, proposed his theory of gravity, where two bodies attracted each other through space. And that struck many scientists of the time as some spooky, supernatural activity. It was thought then that two bodies had to hit each other before there could be an effect. And nonetheless, over time, scientists came around and decided, hey, this works and it explains some things, and they accepted it. And the other more modern example is the Big Bang theory. Back in the 1930s, most scientists thought that the universe was infinite and unchanging. But then it was noticed that the galaxies seemed to be receding from Earth and receding from each other, as if in the aftermath of a big explosion. And it doesn't take much to kind of replay that scenario in your mind and say, well, if they're moving away, there must have been a time in the past when they were all together in a very small space, and that was the beginning of the Big Bang theory. Now, it turns out that many scientists hated that idea, including physicists, because it seemed to point to an absolute beginning for the world and maybe a creation of the world. And a lot of scientists still hate the idea of the Big Bang. It turns they're a little more subtle about it these days, but they don't like the idea of a beginning because it implies something outside of nature, something outside of the universe is responsible for the universe and its properties. So I view intelligent design in the same way, that it might have philosophical, theological implications, and some people might not like those implications, but it's completely based on empirical data, on the experiments and discoveries of scientists in the past 50 or more years that have shown the sophistication of the very foundation of life. So it's a completely scientific idea, whether you like its philosophical implications or not.
So you're kind of hitting on what I wanted to ask you about next, and that is sort of the response that you get from people who dislike these philosophical implications. There's a lot of, it seems, emotion to people that are in opposition of intelligent design. And you look at Wikipedia and it says that you guys are a pseudoscientific group. Mainstream science, mainstream media, things like that, they all sort of have some sort of emotion and even condescension when they talk about the research that people like you or Stephen Meyer or Berlinski, uh, part of your group, put out. Why do you think that is?
Uh, well, probably a lot of different motives for it, varying with various persons and groups, but there's a couple big candidates. One is certainly that there are some people, well, most people will conclude that a designer of life in the universe is functionally God. And they don't like that. A
Mm,
lot of folks, especially in elite uh, circles of society, don't want there to be a God. And they have grown up thinking that science had explained it all. They didn't need to worry about it. Heck, science can explain how life arises and how the universe just starts from nothing. And so they would, if they if they credited it or they thought that it was possible, then they'd have to work out worldview implications of such a thing. Another more mundane reason is that a lot of scientists want to be in charge. They want to say, we can, explain everything, so we don't need you, priests and philosophers and, holy guys, and we will take care of this. Thank you very much. But when you ask them, oh, great, you can explain it. They say, yeah. And you ask them and they just wave their hands. Um, um, and there's connected to that with scientific societies and the press, they've told us for a long time that they had everything under control. And if they admit that some obscure professor from some college in Eastern Pennsylvania has pointed out a fundamental difficulty for the problem, then that's pretty embarrassing. And yeah, you can tell that they're kind of on their back feet, in the back of their feet, because of the emotion that's usually comes with these denials. They will either say, they will say, well, sure, we can't explain that now, but we can explain it. We'll figure it out in the future. Okay. Or they'll say, this Behe fellow, he's got bad breath. He's, he can barely see. Who's going to listen to somebody like that? I say that it's something else. So they change the subject, or they talk about something. They give ad hominem arguments, and so a good place to see exactly that is in that book I mentioned, A Mousetrap for Darwin, where I collect my responses. And it's astonishing to me that these real smart guys, very, very intelligent, it's nobody's doubting the intelligence of these people. They have no explanation, and they make the worst logical mistakes when they address this topic. And so, it's clear that they just don't want this to be true. And they, whether they admit it to themselves or not, they're just trying to divert attention from a major problem for Darwin and a major pointer to what everybody in the world has thought was necessary for life, that is intelligent design. But they have a lot of cultural power, and so they can make a lot of noise and not suffer any consequences. But the bottom line is that intelligent design, 25 years on from when I started in it, just gets stronger and stronger with each passing discovery of science.
That's what it seems, specifically with the fine tuning argument. I know you've done work in that as well. I would like to talk about that. I don't know if we'll have time today, because I do also want to talk about your most recent book, Darwin Devolves.
Mhm.
Um, Darwin's Black Box was incredible, and the arguments in it are incredible. Uh, and Darwin Devolves to me is just even it's even a greater step towards sort of nailing in the coffin. So can you sort of give us just an explanation of what you talk about in Darwin Devolves?
Yes, it's a kind of a snide title that its main point is that Darwin's mechanism of random changes and natural selection does work for small changes. But usually, or the great majority of the time, rather, not just usually, it works by breaking something that was already there, breaking or degrading a gene that the organism already had. So that the surprise is that rather than evolution, his mechanism strongly promotes devolution, the loss of genetic information. And I give a lot of examples in the book. One I start with, because it's cool, is the polar bear. Polar bear is thought to have descended from the brown bear, grizzly bear. And it turns out the key to our new knowledge, the stuff that I wrote about in this book was not able to be written about 25 years ago when I wrote Darwin's Black Box. The key is that the instrumentation and sophisticated new methods have been developed to sequence the genes, sequence the whole DNA of entire organisms. I mean, most people know that the human genome has been sequenced, and that was done in 1990, or I'm sorry, 2000, around the year 2000. And and it's only progressed. The ability to sequence the genetic uh, genetic complement of species has only progressed, and it's really astoundingly fast and very, very cheap these days compared to back in the year 2000 when Bill Clinton and Tony Blair announced the sequencing of the human genome. So the point is that not only have humans had their genome sequenced, but so have chimpanzees and dogs and cats and fish and birds and plants, rice, and all sorts of bacteria, all sorts of invertebrates. And included among them are the grizzly bear and the polar bear. It turns out their entire genomes have been sequenced. And when you're sequencing those things, it's just for laughs, or it's just to because you can do it easily. Nonetheless, people said, well, grizzly bear, polar bear, clearly the one descended from the other. What were the genes that had to change, or what new things came along? And so, since everything's coded in the DNA, they could compare the grizzly with the polar bear. And they saw that 19 genes, 17 particular genes were the most strongly selected. That means they were most helpful in changing or in the polar bear. And the number one gene that was most strongly selected was a mutation that broke a gene that's involved in the pigmentation of the brown bear's fur. And so without pigmentation, turns out it's white. It turns out to be white. And we have all heard of albino organisms that lack pigmentation. Well, okay, but that is a loss of a gene. And the second most helpful mutation was a mutation in a gene that's involved in the metabolism of cholesterol. And it turns out that's important because although grizzly bears eat berries and maybe rabbits and other things, grizzly bears eat seal blubber. The blubber of seals is a main part of their diet, and it's very, of course, fatty. It's all fat. And so in order to adjust to that diet, it had to adjust its metabolism. And one of the mutation that was involved in that broke a gene that is present in the grizzly bear, making it inactive. And that stopped cholesterol from being transported into the blood as much as before. And that protected the grizzly bear's circulation from the bad effects of that cholesterol. We know that when we eat too much cholesterol, we got big problems. But because of this loss of a gene, the polar bear can eat much more fat. And for the other 15 genes, the great majority, again, were ones that lost or were broken or lost effectiveness. So it turns out that an example, a kind of a paradigm example of evolution is due to devolution rather than to evolution.
So would you say that the large majority of mutations are devolution as opposed to evolution?
Well, a couple of distinctions. About half of mutations that occur in an organism are what are called neutral. They don't affect the organism much one way or another. It's pretty much as fit as before. Of the ones that do have an effect, the vast majority are deleterious. They hurt the organism. And just a teeny tiny number that occur are ones that are beneficial to the organism, that actually help it adapt to something. It turns out that the great majority of those beneficial ones, people had thought, well, they must be constructing things. They're the things that made a bear in the first place, or a bird, or the bacterial flagellum, or molecular machinery. The surprising, astounding thing that is now obvious from the ability to sequence genes very easily is that the great majority of even the beneficial genes are ones that break, beneficial mutations are ones that break genes. There's another, if you look at any organism, you see the same thing. There's a study by a man named Richard Lenski, who's at the Michigan State University, and he grew bacteria in his lab in order to watch how they evolved and changed. And he started in the year 1990 and has continued up to this day. And since bacteria reproduce so quickly, they have actually gone through something like 70,000 generations in those 30 years. And there have been trillions of these guys produced. And in the early 2000s, it became possible to sequence the whole genome of these bacteria. They're called E. coli. And in the year 2015, he and his colleagues put out a definitive analysis of the genomes of these bugs. And it turns out that of the top 60 genes, all of them very likely either broke or degraded the effect of the genes that they occurred in. There might have been one or two that might have gone sideways or something, but at least 57 or 58 out of 60 were degradatory. Now that has implications too. If the first thing that natural selection and mutation do is to help an organism adapt to an environment, but they do it by throwing away genetic information, then the descendants will have less genetic information. And when the next environmental change comes along, they will have fewer possible ways to adapt than did the prior generation. So over time, an organism will become more and more brittle, more and more unable to respond effectively to environmental changes. And so looking back, you say, hey, let's see, most of the organisms, most of the species in history have gone extinct. Maybe it's because they had a certain amount of flexibility and genetic information, and over time they adapted by throwing some of it away, and they eventually came to a point where they simply couldn't adapt effectively anymore, and that's what caused their extinction. So looking at it that way, you can start to justify or understand some biological facts.
I just want to sort of re-clarify that ending part there, because I think the natural question that I was thinking of is whether it's evolution or devolution. As long as animals are adapting to their environment, why does it really matter? It still sort of seems like it's going along with Darwinian theory in a way, in essence, as long as they're still adapting to their environment. So can you expound on that a little bit more? Why does it even matter if they're devolving?
Yeah, that's a good point, and in a sense, it doesn't. The animals are happier. The polar bear is completely at home in its environment, and it's better adapted to that than brown bears. And it's clearly true from this information that the mechanism of random mutation and natural selection can adapt organisms to different environments. The only distinction, or the greatest distinction, is that it's not building anything. And therefore, it cannot explain where those systems came from in the first place. And it has been stated by many scientists that the most important point of Darwin's theory, or the most important, why it is so very important, is that it explains the appearance of intelligent design, and therefore we don't need to have a mind behind life. We don't need an explanation for some creator or somebody who arranged life. But if Darwin's theory can't explain where those things came from in the first place, then it cannot explain the apparent design of life. It can't explain how things adapt to some changes in the environment, but it can't explain where they came from in the first place. And I should add, that's the most philosophically important point. It's also perhaps the most important scientific question, and Darwin's theory can't account for that, but intelligent design can do so.
So I kind of want to help our viewers picture this. If I'm understanding it correctly, Darwin's theory sort of starts with the tree of life, right? There's this single origin, and then the species become more and more complex, and then we have different class, phyla, and things like this from the single origin. But from your research and from your book, you're essentially stating that no, we have all these different complex structures, and they're degrading over time and getting worse genetically.
That's correct. That is right. And as a matter of fact, if you look in the scientific literature, you can see, strong hints of that, even beyond what we can draw firm conclusions from. For example, there's papers that say, well, the primordial cell, the first cell, or at least the ancestor of all the cells that are alive today, was much, much more complex than people had thought. And that's interesting. It means that, well, you can adjust to this environment by losing something here and maybe adjust to a different environment by losing something over here. But what is not explained is the starting point. How did this very complex cell come from in the first place? Now you're just hand waving again. The new scientific results don't help explain it. And within lines, there are papers that say, gee whiz, vertebrates started with a lot more genes than they seem to have now. And different groups of vertebrates have preserved certain groups of genes. And yeast, which is not a vertebrate, it's a fungus. There are different branches of yeast. And there are papers that say, well, the ancestor of the yeast had all those genes, and different branches lost different genes to specialize in different environments, different foods, and so on. So Darwin's theory, at least that implication of it, is completely opposite to what we are finding out now. And I want to re-emphasize that it's only been in the past 10 to 20 years that we have been able to generate the data from which these conclusions are made. And that's because Darwin's theory, the rubber hits the road at the molecular level of life. DNA is a molecule. Proteins, which are the components of the molecular machines of the cell, are molecules. So you have to be able to see the molecular changes in evolving organisms in order to evaluate the reach of Darwin's theory. And that's only been able to be done in the past 20 years. So all these new results that we are discussing here, they might strike everybody as surprising, but it's only because everybody was assuming that Darwin's mechanism could build things up, but without evidence. It just seemed like a smart idea, a pretty good idea. And since it couldn't be tested, people just assumed it was true. And now we've got good experimental evidence that it isn't.
So I kind of wonder, do you think that there are future implications because of what we know now, like for different species, will they become so brittle that they can no longer survive and things like that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a very interesting point that arises from this, that you could say, well, if things evolve too much, then they are very likely to go extinct because they're losing genetic information. It's also the case that some species rather, are known to have lost a lot of genetic information and are pretty fragile and prone to sicknesses and problems. So yeah, we apparently biological line of species or something has a set amount of information, and over time it goes away, and that will lead to a lot of interesting things.
This is really interesting to think about. So before we end it, I want to end on a more personal note. I want to ask you why you got into your field of study.
I in high school, I decided I wanted to study chemistry because chemistry studies molecules, and everything is made of molecules. So I wanted to know how the world works. So I decided to study chemistry. And then in college, I worked for a biochemist for a while. And just the molecules, the astounding things they could do, captivated me. So I wanted to find out how life worked. And So I studied biochemistry, got a PhD in it. And then, a while after my PhD, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, I read this book that I mentioned at the beginning of the program, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And it was skeptical of Darwin's theory, put up a lot of problems that I had never heard of, and I couldn't answer. And so I was shocked because I thought I was being led to believe something, not because the evidence demanded it, but because that's just the way we're supposed to think these days. And when I went to the library and looked up who had tried to explain these phenomenal, complex molecular systems, I discovered that nobody had. There were no explanations. There were barely even just so stories in the literature. Mostly you'd find papers describing some new complex system, and at the end it says something like, isn't it wonderful how evolution has produced this? So essentially just a genuflection to the reigning explanation, but no explanation. And from then on, I became very interested because I was ticked off. I wanted to find out how the world worked. And here I was being fed these stories. And so I've kind of spent the rest of my career looking into it a little further.
That's awesome. That's cool. That's cool. Dr. Behe, for anybody who's just now getting familiar with you for the first time, can you give our viewers some of your resources that you have out?
Well, yeah, my main stuff is my 3 books. The one that somebody interested in this and who wants to learn more should start with is the first book. It's called Darwin's Black Box, and it's available on Amazon. And the second one should probably be my 3rd book, Darwin Devolves, if you're interested in that. But there's also kind of friendly resources for folks who don't really have the time to read a whole book. I've got a website, or there's a website has been produced in my name. There's a website called michaelbehe.com, no space or anything. And on it, I've got a lot of articles and responses to critics, and there's videos, a number of good videos that explain these concepts in friendly terms. So somebody who wants to learn more can go there, and you can certainly use that as an introduction to other resources that are out there too.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, it's been a very interesting conversation. It was great for me to meet you. Honestly, I really look up to you a lot. I love your work.
Thanks very much.
So thanks so much for being on the show, Dr. Behe.
Okay, it was a lot of fun. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye.